Hello, I'm standing in Cuddington Recreation Ground, a public park on the southwest edges of Greater London. I've been photographing the park for the last 4 years as a way of investigating the nature of the public park. And it's this body of work called Cuddington that I want to talk to you about in this presentation. Cuddington Recreation Ground was created in the 1930s when the surrounding houses were built on what was previously agricultural land. The photographs in Cuddington do not aim to show the specifics of this particular park. Rather, I take it and similar parks to be paradigmatic of suburbia, both its actual contemporary manifestation and its historical, pastoral imaginary. My aim is to open up the relationship between the Arcadian dream of suburbia and lived suburban life. Cuddington comprises 3 parts: Arcadia, boundary conditions, and Et in Arcadia ego. Each part has around a dozen photographs, and the whole sequence is intended to be viewed in order. The 3 parts each present different aspects of the park, showing it variously as a landscape, in the sense the term is traditionally used with reference to painting and photography, as a complex meeting point between public and private space, and as a place of temporary habitation and endless passage. My photography of the park started quite casually. A renewed interest in photography found me wanting a subject, and the park was convenient and suited my preference for photographing landscapes and environments. I began with no particular objective in mind, beyond exercising my photography muscle. As I reflected on the gradually accumulating photographs, I started to research the social and geographical history of the area. In parallel, the idea of a wider project, investigating the relationship between photography and sonography, took shape. What began as a casual interest has become a structured research project with its own distinct, emergent methodology. Traditionally, the word sonography is defined as the design of theatre performances, but in the last decade or so, the term expanded sonography has begun to be used, and it is this expanded notion of sonography that provides much of my conceptual framing here. According to McKinney and Palmer, expanded sonography incorporates autonomous art practices that operate in contexts well beyond theatre buildings and engage directly with social as well as the cultural dimensions of contemporary experience. While I briefly describe the park and locate Cuddington as a body of photographs within a social and art historical context, my principal purpose here is to present this project as a methodological inquiry, as interdisciplinary research that frames Cuddington as an artistic work in terms of sonography. The photographs in Cuddington do not fit neatly into a particular tradition of photography, but they are perhaps closest to landscape. For Rod Giblett, landscape is an aesthetic category, a visual experience for the roaming eye that occasionally stops to take in the pleasing, picturesque prospect from a static viewpoint. Even the concept of landscape is political, Giblett argues. A timescape of the colonisation and commodification of the past, present and future. Landscape photography is therefore also political, and I would add that it can not only reveal or conceal actual histories of land usage, but also its imaginaries, how we conceive of the land and landscape. By presenting the park in relation to the aesthetic and formal conventions of landscape photography, I want to open up a dialogue between ideas of the Arcadian, in the sense of a wished-for pastoral idyll, and the suburban, a term often used pejoratively. Robert Fishman argues that the very idea of suburbia is fundamentally utopian, its power derived ultimately from the capacity of suburban design to express a complex and compelling vision of the modern family, freed from the corruption of the city, restored to harmony with nature, endowed with wealth and independence, yet protected by a close-knit, stable community. The bourgeois utopia. For Fishman, suburbia is defined by the primacy of the single-family house set in the greenery of an open parkland setting, and has inherited its characteristic design from the range of architectural styles, landscaping and cultural associations that define the 18th century merchant's villa. Propagated through the picturesque landscape painting tradition exemplified by Claude Lorraine and the work of landscape architects such as Lancelot Capability Brown, the picturesque image of a pastoral landscape, of living in a productively harmonious relationship with nature while escaping the pressures and obligations of urban life, is central to the modern idea of suburbia, even if the reality is rather different. Rachel Hann problematises the picturesque by distinguishing scene and scenographics from the scenic, and so the picturesque. If the scenic treats landscape as if it were a painting and evokes a conceptual division between subject and object, then scenographics results from interventional acts of orientation that explicitly affirm the situational potentiality and temporality of landscape. The scenic picturesque landscape, as critiqued by Giblett, Hann and others, is presented to the viewer as something already determined, controlled and owned, whether by the viewer or others, fixed and distanced. Hann's concept of scenographics offers an alternative to the problematic picturesque. Integral to scenographics is the idea of staging, the making of a scene, pointing towards a different scenographic mode of landscape photography based on staging. Such a mode would involve the deliberate composition of affective stimuli to create an encounter in which we see a place differently. In the first part of Cuddington, Arcadia, the photographs begin by framing the park as a landscape in the conventional sense. The black and white photographs show wide areas of grass, trees silhouetted against big skies and summer afternoon light, evoking the Claudian pastoral mood. As the sequence progresses, the emphasis shifts towards the compositional materials of the park, brought to our attention, staged, one by one. Foliage, clouds, tree trunks, grass, light, shadow. Textural qualities are revealed by light and emphasised by the use of monochrome. The photographs are not simply indexical, pointing to the various materials, but affective. We are invited to feel the cloudiness of the cloud, the woodiness of the wood, the cool shadowiness of the dark spaces within the undergrowth. We are shifting our apparent position and spatial relationship with the landscape. We seem to enter the space of the park itself, rather than standing outside it, looking in. Space is reconfigured, depth is exaggerated, we draw closer to the ground, and gaps in the foliage form frames within frames, structuring the world in new ways. Soon we are deep in the undergrowth, peering out to the park boundary and the rooftops of houses beyond. In the final few photographs, we emerge into sunlight, not only implied by, but felt as, lens flare. Now there is a further transformation. We are enveloped in soft, blossom-like leaves, with sky and clouds above and grass below. The Arcadian idyll has become surreal. McKinney and Palmer identify three distinctive features and concerns of expanded sonography: relationality, affectivity, and materiality. They describe these features as three overlapping and interrelated concepts of the manifestation and experience of sonography in an expanded form. Through the sequence of photographs in Arcadia, these aspects of the park are brought to the fore. The spatial relationships between us, the viewer, the environment of the park, and the suburban housing beyond are emphasised. The physical materials of the park, foliage, tree trunks, grass, clouds, air, light, are felt as well as seen. In Arcadia, I contend, the park and its unstable relationship to its pastoral imaginary has been staged by paying close attention to relationality, affectivity and materiality. We have had, I propose, an encounter. The photographs in boundary conditions shift thematically, focusing on the park's boundary. For most of its perimeter, the park is bordered by houses, with either the back gardens meeting the park directly or with small unmetalled access roads between the public park and the private gardens. These access roads represent a liminal space, neither public nor fully private. Fences, chain link and wooden, walls, gates, small trees, bushes and undergrowth create layers of visibility, while through the detritus of domestic life, garages, garden sheds, bins, diverse discarded objects, we infer the quotidian activities of suburban existence. The scenes presented in boundary conditions are not only miniature stages, scenographies, passively awaiting human actors to fulfil them. The materials of the boundary zone themselves are active in two ways. Firstly, the materials are active in the sense that plants and fences are in a kind of durational performance of growth and decay. Secondly, and more importantly for our scenographic reading of the photographs, the materials act on us, the viewers. Jocelyn McKinney describes the use of discarded materials by the theatre director Tadeusz Kantor, who felt they were capable of transcending their former function and abject vulnerability once they were placed on the stage, where they became a focus for contemplation and revelation. McKinney goes on to argue that the materials from which scenographies are constructed consist of vibrant potentialities which can be active as part of the assemblage which is a performance. In boundary conditions, the act of scenographic staging facilitates the vibrant potentialities of the materials of the park boundary, as well as the materiality of the photographs themselves. Tonal qualities are particularly important in boundary conditions and vary from picture to picture, often invoking the feeling of an old picture postcard or colour slide through shifted, saturated or muted colours. For one viewer at least, the result is a nostalgic return to childhood. The image stopped me in my tracks, and for a moment I didn't breathe. For all it is a photo of nothing, there in front of me was everything that was idyllic and all that was awful, and everything else in between of my childhood to 12 years. As a child, that is figuratively how we see the world. We are immersed, and there is no objectivity and overview. The vibrant materiality of the photographs in boundary conditions is central to their affective potentiality. Writing about the authoring of space, Teja Brezek joins McKinney in emphasising potentiality rather than fixity, stating that it is expanded scenography's fluid articulation of staging spaces between the disciplines of theatre, exhibition, installation, media and architecture that renders it particularly suitable to formulate speculative spaces of potentiality. In the photographs in boundary conditions, our view is sometimes clear, sometimes blocked, sometimes partially obscured and subdivided by tree trunks and layers of foliage. From our position within the public park, we see voyeuristically into semi-private and private space. Boundary conditions stages not only the material circumstances of the boundary, but also our mutual social relationships and orderings of space. We may expect to be visible in the public space of the park, but the porosity that allows private citizens to see out into public space also allows the public to see into private space, to just the extent the semi-permeable layers of fences, trees and outbuildings permit. Within the usual suburban schema, the private citizen can see the public realm from within their private domestic space without in turn being seen. In boundary conditions, this schema is destabilised, rendered fluid. Adopting Brezek's term, the conventional suburban orderings of space are re-authored. In the third and final part of Cuddington, Et in Arcadia Ego, we see the human inhabitants of the park directly for the first time. The formal qualities of the photographs return to those at the start of Part 1. Black and white images show the landscape illuminated by late afternoon light, but now populated by users of the park, walking dogs, cycling and playing. The pastoral idyll is now a place of leisure activities. Margaret Burney Vickery argues that the landscape tradition exemplified by Claude was only part of the development of the pastoral paradigm underlying the idea of suburbia. Instead of Roman antiquity, Dutch-influenced landscape painters of the 17th century onward represented the contemporary working landscape. Windmills and linen bleaching grounds were indicators of prosperity and modernity, of mankind in productive harmony with nature. For Vickery, this productive pastoral conception of landscape and its habitation has been lost through industrialisation and suburbanisation, and as a result, the bucolic pastoral wended its way into suburban enclaves and urban and national parks, designed for recreational pleasures. In the making of public parks as part of suburban housing developments, the idea of the private landscaped estate of the 18th century landowner was democratised, while the productive pastoral of the former agricultural land was made bourgeois. The park, paradigmatic of suburbia, represents more than the bourgeois utopia, the triumphant assertion of middle-class values. It also reflects the alienation of the middle classes from the urban industrial world they themselves were creating. The title of the third part of Cuddington derives from a painting by Nicolas Poussin, in which a group of shepherds living in Arcadia come across a tomb with the inscription "Et in Arcadia ego," translated as "Even in Arcadia, there am I." The I in this phrase is often taken to refer to death, so the paintings are read as memento mori, reminders that death is ever present. However, there is an alternative reading. The person buried in this tomb once lived in Arcadia. For art historian Erwin Panofsky, the painting represents either a bygone happiness ended by death, or a present happiness menaced by death. These diverse readings of Arcadia and the productive pastoral landscape are the stepping-off point for the final part of Cuddington. The photographs in Et in Arcadia ego show the denizens of the park as small figures in the landscape, echoing those in the paintings of Claude and others. Like extras in a play, the anonymous figures in Old Master paintings, or staffage, imbue landscapes with life and create intriguing narratives. Though here, shepherds, fishermen and travellers are replaced by walkers and their dogs, cyclists and running children. As staffage, they are generic typical figures carrying out generalised activities. Compositional devices such as leading lines draw our attention to the diminutive figures, but still their individual specificity is difficult to discern. People pass through the park but do not seem to interact. Trees and light arrange the composition into subsidiary frames, suggesting narrative progression after the fashion of a strip cartoon, but such stories as we might suppose do not resolve. In this final part of Cuddington, the park that was proposed and questioned as a pastoral idyll in the first part is restaged, and further ambiguities emerge. Through the affective materials of trees, grass and light, of compositional organisation, space is again authored, and an unstable relationality is staged. My photographic project Cuddington aims to open up the relationship between the Arcadian dream of suburbia and lived suburban life, questioning stereotypical received ideas of suburbia. Drawing on the work of Rachel Han and others, I argue that scenographies, and therefore photographs that adopt strategies of staging that are integral to scenographics, act upon the viewer, rather than being passive objects for the viewer to observe unmoved. I frame this active capacity in terms of the authoring of space from Brejec and the three characteristic concerns of an expanded conception and practice of scenography identified by McKinney and Palmer: relationality, affectivity and materiality. I want to emphasise the reflexive nature of this practice research. The account of the photographs in Cuddington I have given here is partially retrospective, theorising after the fact, but the process of framing the photographic project in terms of scenographic theory and social and art history has changed the way I photograph, edit and present the work. For McKinney and Palmer, scenographic practices have the potential to make not only a distinct contribution to our understanding of new forms of theatre and performance, but to areas such as art and design, architecture and cultural geography as well. My methodology offers the means to apply established theories of scenography in new ways and in new contexts, enabling enriched insights in these and related disciplinary fields. Our understanding of scenographic theory is deepened in turn. Applying this interdisciplinary method to my project Cuddington has revealed the photographs themselves and their subject, the suburban park, and its pastoral imaginary, Arcadia, in distinctively scenographic terms.